On the stone floor of Szejta Castle, a red stain spread like torn velvet. A frail body trembled at her feet, while above loomed the glassy, merciless eyes of Elizabeth Báthory. They called her the Blood Countess. Yet in the suffocating dark of her private chamber, there was no title, only the smell of burning wax, the stench of scorched flesh, and the soft laugh of a woman who believed beauty was a throne worth killing for. She needed no crown, no sword. Her true weapon was her own pale skin she was convinced could be fed by the blood of others. That obsession was her fatal flaw, the terror of losing youth. And tell me, if every wrinkle felt like a knife carving away your power, would you surrender to time? Or would you dare to carve the knife back into someone else? The hem of her gown dragged across the stone, smeared by droplets still hot. The peasant girl collapsed, and Elizabeth tilted her head as if she had just finished painting a masterpiece in agony. In that moment, power did not come from bloodline. It came from cruelty. But what she could not see, what you cannot yet see, is that this game of blood would summon a price greater than beauty, greater than death itself. And that price was already moving closer, step by step, in the dark. The castle was not only stone and blood, it was a cage. Behind its walls, Elizabeth was bound by something far more suffocating than iron chains. Family name, noble lineage, and the eyes of men who pretended to serve her while plotting her ruin. She was a Bathory, married into the powerful Nádasdy clan, tied to Hungary's oldest and most ruthless houses. On parchment, her rank was unshakable. In truth, every banquet, every mass, every whisper in the corridors of Vienna was another snare tightening around her throat. They spoke of her wealth. They spoke of her cruelty. But the one thing they never spoke of aloud was her vulnerability. The way beauty was her only shield in a world that devoured women who aged. And this shield, she feared, was already cracking. So the killings were not only indulgence, they were strategy, a ritual of preservation. Each drop of blood was, in her mind, a brick fortifying the walls around her throne. Yet those same walls were beginning to close in. What Elizabeth did not know, and what you cannot yet know, is that every scream in the night left an echo that carried far beyond her chamber walls, to rival families, to hungry priests, to the Habsburg court itself. The girl on the floor was forgotten by dawn, but her absence was a question whispered in a village, then a county, then a kingdom. And those whispers would one day rise louder than the countess's laughter. Elizabeth believed she was feeding her youth. In truth, she was feeding the fire that would burn her world, and in that fire, her fatal flaw would be exposed for all to see. The castle no longer slept. Servants walked the halls with eyes lowered, ears straining against the silence that never lasted. At night, screams broke through the stones, brief, muffled, and then gone. Elizabeth believed the walls would keep her secrets. Instead, they carried her voice farther than she knew. A maid vanished after spilling wine on her gown. Another disappeared for daring to look too long at her mirror. The countess insisted they had fled, ungrateful and cowardly. But in the villages below, whispers turned into rumors, and rumors into warnings. Stay away from the castle. Stay away from her. Elizabeth's flaw was tightening its grip. Every wrinkle she imagined was a sentence of death for someone else. She gazed at polished silver until dawn, searching for lines, for cracks in the mask she refused to lose. If youth slipped, power slipped, and she could not allow that. Here lies the question for you. If your power, your survival, depended on the skin you wore, would you sacrifice another's flesh to protect it? Or would you dare to face the slow cruelty of time itself? The rituals grew darker. Blood was collected in bowls, smeared across her face as if it were perfume. Servants learned to stay silent, to avert their eyes. But silence was not loyalty, it was fear. Fear spreads faster than devotion. And in courts ruled by envy, fear is the scent of blood in water. What Elizabeth did not see was how many eyes now turned toward her lands. Rivals who smelled scandal, priests who smelled heresy, kings who smelled weakness. Her thirst for eternal youth was no longer hidden in the dark. It had begun to echo through corridors of power, and soon those echoes would demand a reckoning she could not avoid. The rumors had become too loud to ignore. Letters carried them across Hungary, and Hungary carried them to Vienna. At court, where every scandal was a weapon, Elizabeth's name began to slip between jeweled lips. She believed she had hidden her rituals. In truth, her servants whispered to travelers. Priests scribbled reports. Rivals sharpened their knives on every disappearance. Each scream inside Szeged Castle had found an audience outside its walls. Still, Elizabeth walked through her halls with the arrogance of a queen. Gilded mirrors lined the chambers, each one reflecting a face she could not bear to lose. The women she destroyed were no longer peasants in her mind. They were ingredients, wine for her skin, marrow for her pride. She called it survival. Others called it blasphemy. The fatal flaw deepened. Her need for youth grew more desperate as her power grew fragile. She could not stop. She would not stop. To her, every stain of blood was proof she still ruled. But here is the secret no one dared speak aloud, and one you do not yet know. The Habsburg court had begun to collect testimonies. Every priest, every noble with a grudge, every rival with a claim to her land. They gathered each whisper like a bead of blood, stringing them into a chain that would one day bind her. Elizabeth, blind in her obsession, saw only the surface. The way her skin glowed after each ritual. The way courtiers still bowed, lips trembling with fear. She mistook silence for loyalty, fear for devotion. And so the Countess continued. Bowls of blood hidden under silk, screams drowned beneath hymns, a masquerade of cruelty masquerading as power. Yet the court was watching, and when courts watch, they do not forgive. Elizabeth thought she was untouchable, but in Vienna her downfall was already being drafted line by line, in ink as dark as the blood on her hands. And soon, those papers would become chains. In the villages below Szeged, mothers locked their daughters inside at dusk. In the markets, merchants whispered that the Countess's shadow stretched farther than the castle walls. Even priests who once took her coin began to lower their eyes when her name was spoken. Elizabeth sensed it, the shifting air of suspicion. Yet suspicion did not frighten her. Time did. A single glance in the mirror, a single flicker of imagined decay, was enough to send her deeper into the rituals. What others called madness, she called necessity. The circle was closing. A cousin at court questioned her accounts. A bishop demanded audiences she refused to grant. Rumors of vanished servants were no longer confined to taverns. They were entering chancelleries, woven into political intrigue. But Elizabeth, instead of retreating, expanded the carnage. Now the rituals were no longer confined to the private chambers. Dungeons beneath the castle became theaters of cruelty. Screams rolled up the stairwells like smoke from burning incense. The Countess stood above them, silk gowns brushing against iron shackles, as though cruelty itself were a coronation. Here lies the challenge for you. If your survival meant feeding on those beneath you, would you stop when their faces haunted you, or would you double the feast until no one dared oppose you? Her fatal flaw was now visible to all who dared look. The obsession for youth had grown into spectacle, a grotesque performance. Servants no longer believed they were safe. Nobles no longer believed she was untouchable. And the church began to wonder if God himself had abandoned her halls. Yet still, Elizabeth smiled in the mirror, tracing her fingers along the glow of her skin, convincing herself the price was worth it. Every death was a victory over time. Every scream was an anthem of her defiance. What she did not understand was that each anthem added a voice to the chorus rising against her. And that chorus was no longer whispering, it was roaring. Soon, the roar would reach her gates. Winter closed around Chejte Castle like a shroud. Snow buried the villages, but inside the walls, heat rose from the dungeons. The fires never went out. Neither did the screams. By now, the killings were no longer whispered crimes. They were an open pattern. Too many girls vanished. Too many mothers wept at locked doors. Priests rode on horseback to petition nobles. Nobles carried rumors to Vienna. The court knew. The church knew. Everyone knew. Elizabeth faced a choice. Stop, and perhaps silence would settle. Or continue, and gamble that her name was too powerful to be touched. For a moment, brief as candlelight, she hesitated, but the mirror decided for her. In its silver face, she saw not youth but decay, waiting, creeping, gnawing at the edges of her power. To surrender was to die. To continue was to live, no matter the cost. And here lies the question for you. If survival meant choosing between silence and atrocity, which would you embrace? Would you endure the slow rot of age, or sharpen your knife against the flesh of another? Elizabeth chose the knife. The rituals expanded, no longer secret, no longer careful. Girls were dragged from villages under false promises of work. Their blood-filled basins splashed against marble. The Countess laughed as attendants trembled, as if terror itself was her coronation song. Her fatal flaw had devoured her. What began as an obsession had become an addiction, and what began in shadows was now a spectacle. There was no return, no undoing. Every drop of blood was a contract sealing her fate. And beyond her castle, forces gathered. Priests compiling testimony, nobles compiling debts, kings compiling pretexts. The circle was no longer tightening, it was closing. Elizabeth believed she had won another battle against time. In truth, she had declared war against the world, and the world was preparing to answer. The first summons arrived in ink, not in chains. A letter sealed with the crest of the Palatine, sent under the authority of the Habsburg court. It demanded her presence. It demanded answers. Elizabeth laughed when she read it. To her, parchment was weaker than blood. Words could be burned. Seals could be broken. She had survived whispers before. She would survive these. But this was not a whisper. It was the beginning of a net, cast wide and pulled tight. Witnesses had been gathered, servants who fled, priests who listened, nobles who envied. Their testimonies were ink on parchment now, no longer rumor. The crown had begun to build a case, stone by stone, word by word. Elizabeth continued her rituals, certain her name would shield her. To her, the screams echoing through the dungeons were still power, still proof she could not be touched. But in Vienna, each scream had already become evidence. Here lies the secret you are not supposed to know. Behind closed doors, the Palatine swore to end her reign of blood. Not for justice, not for God, but because her lands, her wealth, her power could be seized the moment she fell. Her beauty was not the only thing at stake. Her dynasty itself had become prey, and still, the Countess gazed into her mirrors, seeing only what she wished to see: eternal youth, untouchable grace. She did not see the ink drying on decrees of arrest. She did not hear the hooves of riders carrying orders across frozen roads. She did not feel the walls closing in. Every act of cruelty she performed now was no longer hidden. It was recorded, remembered, sharpened into a blade meant for her throat. Elizabeth thought she was beyond reach. In truth, she had already been caught. And when the net began to close, even her blood would not be enough to break free. The night was broken by torchlight. Hooves struck the frozen earth outside Chejte Castle as riders surrounded its gates. They came not as guests, but as hunters. At their head rode György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, carrying the authority of king and court alike. Behind him trailed priests, soldiers, and scribesmen who would record, men who would condemn, men who would profit. Elizabeth met them at the threshold, wrapped in velvet and steel-eyed defiance. She did not bow. She did not tremble. To her, the torches were no brighter than candles, and men no stronger than the girls she had broken. Thurzo read the charges aloud: murder, torture, blasphemy. The words were ash in the wind, but the ink on parchment was iron. Servants testified. Villagers spoke. Corpses were unearthed. For the first time, Elizabeth's throne of silence began to crack. And here lies the challenge for you. If dragged before power, accused by voices you thought beneath you, would you bow your head to survive, or spit in their faces to prove you were still untouchable? Elizabeth spat. She denied everything. She laughed at the priests. She mocked the nobles. She called the witnesses liars, traitors, cowards. To her, the trial was theater, and she was still the star. But beyond her words, the evidence stood. Bodies did not lie. Testimonies did not burn so easily as parchment, and the Palatine had no intention of letting her walk free. The Countess believed her name would shield her. The court believed her name was already poison. The confrontation had begun. And in this battle, there would be no mercy. The trial was not held in marble halls, but in the chambers of her own castle. The walls that once echoed with screams now filled with testimony. Servants described bowls of blood. Witnesses spoke of corpses hidden in cellars. Priests swore before God that she had mocked his name with every ritual. Elizabeth sat through it all, her face pale and sharp as carved stone. She denied, deflected, laughed, but each word against her was another crack in her armor, each witness another blade. For years she had believed beauty was her throne, cruelty her crown. Now those very weapons were paraded as proof of her downfall. The fatal flaw she clutched so tightly had been ripped into the open. Her obsession with youth had not preserved her, it had destroyed her. And here is the truth no mirror ever told her, and one you now see. Elizabeth was never immortal. She was only feared, and fear, once broken, never returns. The Countess still spat at the court, still called her accusers liars, yet her words fell flat against the weight of evidence. The faces around her were no longer trembling. They were resolute. They smelled blood not her victims, but hers. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess, was condemned, her lands seized, her titles stripped, her name dragged through mud darker than any dungeon floor. She had sought to live forever. Instead, she was already being buried alive in reputation, in law, in history. The climax had come, and Elizabeth had lost. But the cruelty of her fate was not yet finished. They did not burn her. They did not hang her. They walled her alive inside her own castle. A single chamber, bricked shut, no window, no door, only a slit for food and air. Stone by stone, her kingdom became her coffin. Elizabeth Báthory, once draped in velvet and feared across nations, now lived in silence. No mirrors, no attendants, no screams to drown out the ticking of time. Only darkness and the slow betrayal of her own flesh. For years, she paced the narrow room, tracing her fingers along the rough wall. She whispered to herself. She laughed at ghosts. She cursed the priests, the nobles, the palatine. But no one answered. Her beauty faded. Her body withered. And still she clawed at the stone, as though her nails could cut through fate itself. But fate, like stone, did not yield. The Blood Countess had sought eternity. Instead, she found oblivion. Here is the truth you must face. Elizabeth did not die when the last brick was placed. She died slowly, every day, with every wrinkle she could no longer deny. Her fatal flaw had devoured her. Her obsession with youth bought her nothing but decay in darkness, and her name, once a weapon, became a curse whispered in fear and disgust. And now the question turns to you. What would you pay to defy time? Would you surrender to its cruelty or gamble everything, as she did, only to discover that the price was your soul? Elizabeth Báthory paid that price, and history never forgot the debt.